forward. Pleasurable expectation. We all feel it, but how does that happen when we don't know what's coming or when it's coming? Are we all secretly psychic? Probably not, but maybe you are. But the real thing that fuels our curious brains and makes us love the sense of the unknown is actually the hormone dopamine. So many of you might know the hormone dopamine as the happiness hormone, but I think that the scary truth of dopamine is that it would be better labeled as an addiction hormone. Dopamine controls our sense of motivation, mood, and pleasure. I personally have my own dopamine story. Last spring, I tore my right ACL, and I went instantly from being in all kinds of activities, being really active in my life, to suddenly having to sit at home alone for long periods of time. And this caused me to feel these feelings of deep, unexplainable, almost uncontrollable sadness. And so I did some research, and I found that I probably was not releasing enough dopamine. And so I know that I was going to live with this injury for about another 8 more months, and I did some research and I found that dopamine can help you with your everyday life or it can harm your everyday life. So I am going to tell you about what dopamine is, the benefits of dopamine, and the harms that this powerful hormone can do to our lives. So first, what is dopamine? Dopamine is a neuromodulator that is involved in our sense of memory, pleasure, reward, and motivation, according to an article by the Cleveland Clinic, a nonprofit medical center, in 2018. The first part that we need to understand about dopamine is that we have a baseline level of dopamine, which is partially genetic, but it can vary throughout the experiences throughout our lives. So maybe you know somebody who's super lazy, or maybe you know somebody who just seems to have endless drive and motivation. This is probably a difference in your baseline level of dopamine. So generally, people with higher levels of baseline dopamine tend to be happier and more motivated, which is exactly what we want. However, we have to be super careful with dopamine because we don't want to override our nervous system with too much, which seems kind of counterintuitive. But when we do things that release a high amount of dopamine, we're actually taking from a fixated supply in our brains. And when we take and take and take, it is going to lower our baseline lower and lower, making us generally more sad. So the other part of dopamine that we need to understand is what is causing these high releases of dopamine, which is dopamine peaks, which we get from doing exercise or maybe from doing substances like alcohol. So again, when we experience these high peaks, we're taking from a fixated supply, which is what we don't want because we don't want to have too much decrease in our baseline level of dopamine. So seems easy enough, right? Just don't do things that cause too much release in dopamine. Wrong. Remember when I said that dopamine would be better named the addiction hormone? This is because when we do this, it literally rewires our brain to rely on these high releases of dopamine to feel happy again because we're at such a sad state. So let's move past addiction and let's move towards a happier note on how we can use dopamine in a healthy way that doesn't override our neural system. So one of the best ways that I really like to do is exercise. Have you ever heard of runner's high? This high is actually based from the release of the brain chemical called endocannabinoids, which is actually what cannabis mimics, and can actually be induced by any high-intensity exercise. So according to health psychologist Dr. Kelly McGonigal, in her 2020 web article, these brain chemicals release dopamine. So for somebody who enjoys running, on average, they can release dopamine that is 2 times above their base level, which is a great amount to release. It's not too much. For somebody who doesn't enjoy running, however, they can receive little to no release in dopamine, which is what we don't want. So maybe you want to release dopamine in a healthy way, but exercise isn't your thing. There's something super easy that you can do, and it's love. Our brains are literally wired to want to be connected to one another. Dr. Schwartz and Dr. Olds, who are Harvard Medical School professors, found that people's brain regions became rich in dopamine when simply shown pictures of people that they loved from their article from spring 2015. And it goes even further than that. Not only when we're shown pictures of people we love, but when we talk about people we love, we actually release dopamine. And it gets even better. Not only when we're talking about people that we love, but when we're talking about things we love, we release dopamine. In fact, I'm probably getting dopamine released right now because I love talking about dopamine. So let's move on to some of the unhealthy ways that dopamine can affect our lives. The main way the dopaminergic system can harm our everyday lives is through its strong pathways towards addiction. Generally, when we hear of somebody who's addicted to something, we don't think of them as happy or living a fulfilling lifestyle. The National Institute on Drug Abuse, a federal research institute, states that drugs release dopamine in our brains that cause us to get addicted to high amounts of pleasure based on an article from March 2022. There's a drug called amphetamine that actually releases enough dopamine to peak 10 times above our base level, which is way too much, and literally rewires our dopaminergic circuits to rely on that amphetamine for happiness again. Another thing that is a not so healthy releaser of dopamine is something that we carry around with us every single day, our cell phones. Social media can trigger dopamine release similar to the way drugs can, opening a pathway to addiction as stated by experts Moines Area and his colleagues in their journal article published in December 2021. There's so much instant gratification on social media, and now studies have shown that it's just as addictive as drugs can be. And with the growing problem of mental health in social media, we need to realize that dopamine is scary for our future. So now we understand how dopamine can affect our everyday lives. We understand that it can make us happy and keep us doing the things that we love, but it can also harm our lives with strong links to addiction. I think the best way to use dopamine is actually to fall in love with effort, rather than the reward of the things that you put effort into. And through that, you've unlocked the key to endless motivation and drive, where happiness is at our fingertips, or rather the tips of your neurons, and where our own success is limitless. Thank you.